I've previously described how to manage shared preferences from Java code. You can also manage preferences through preference activities. These are activities with an automated user interface that's managed by the framework. You define your preferences in an XML file, similar to an XML menu file, and then access the values with Java code. Typically, you should wrap your preferences screen in a fragment so that it maintains its state as the device's orientation or other configuration changes. In this version of the application, I've added a new activity class called prefsActivity.java. It has an XML layout file that includes just a single frame layout. I've also added an item to my options menu with an ID of action settings. I'll do everything else in this demonstration. I'll create a new preferences XML file. These go in a resource directory named XML. I'll create a new resource directory and set the resource type to XML. The default directory name is XML, and click OK. Then I'll go to that new directory and I'll create a new XML resource file, and I'll name it settings.xml. This file can be named whatever you want, but it must have an XML file extension. The XML file extension is assumed to be for use with preferences, so I get a design view that has a preferences palette over here, and I can drag in a checkbox preference, an edit text preference, or any of these others. I can also group preferences using a preference category. I'm going to keep this simple. I'll just add a checkbox preference to my file. You can set the properties over here in the Properties window, or you can go into text mode and make the changes here. The default value for a checkbox preference is false, and I'll leave it that way. This produces a Boolean value. Next, I'll set the title, and this can be any string you want, and it will be seen by the user. Keep this string short and on a single line. I'll set the title to Display in Grid. You can also add a longer value in the Summary attribute, and I'll set that to a longer description. If you're following good programming practices, you'll use string resources instead of literal strings. And in fact, I already have a string resource available. So I'll replace this with string/display in grid. The key is just like the key in the Java version. It's how you're going to access the value when you code in Java, but you set it in an XML file with a string resource. And once again, I've already created one named pref_display_grid. The value for this won't be seen by the user, so it can be anything you want. That's how I've set it up. So now I've defined my preferences and I'm ready to display them. I'll go to the class prefsActivity. This is a generic activity right now that's extended from AppCompat_activity to make it backward compatible to older versions of Android. I'm going to define a member class. I'll name it SettingsFragment, and it'll extend the class PreferenceFragment. When the fragment loads, the onCreate method will be called, just like any fragment, and I'll override that method. And after the superclass's call, I'll use a method named addPreferencesFromResource, and I'll pass in the resource ID of my new settings.xml file. The actual name of the file is settings.xml. The ID is r.xml.settings. Next, I need to load the fragment from the activity. That code will go in the onCreate method of the activity, and it'll be a fragment transaction. I'll start with getFragmentManager, then I'll call .beginTransaction, then add. I'll use a version of the add method that takes two arguments: the resource ID of a container that's defined in my XML layout file, and a fragment. The ID will be r.id.prefsContent, and that's the ID of my frame layout in the XML layout file. And then I'll instantiate my new settings fragment class and pass it in. And then finally, I'll commit the transaction. So now as the activity loads, it loads the fragment into the container. The fragment itself is responsible for going and getting the preference definition and loading that. Now I'll go back to the main activity class. In the main activity class, in the onOptionsItemSelected method, I already have code looking for the action settings ID that I added to the menu. And here I'll create a new intent, and I'll call it settingsintent, and I'll instantiate it with new intent. I'll pass in this as the context, and then prefsActivity.class. And then I'll start the activity. You don't need to use start activity for a result. You won't be getting a result back in that way from this sort of activity. Instead, you'll be able to listen for changes to the settings that are being affected by the preferences activity. So I'll pass in settings intent, and now all the pieces of the puzzle are in place. The user chooses the menu choice, and that launches the activity. The activity loads the fragment, and the fragment loads the settings. And I'll run the application. I'll click the settings button, and there's the result. I see the one and only option that I generated. I'll deselect the option and click the back button. Then I'll click settings again, and I'll see that the state has been changed. And I can now go into the file manager in Android Studio and look at the XML file that's been generated. These settings are saved in an XML file that uses the application's unique ID as the beginning of the file name. And you can read these values from the file using Java code just like before.